Well, first of all, I want to thank Nate and Juliana for such a great conference, and I've been so enjoying the talk so far. And you know, the talk this morning that Kate gave on online psychology, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go into the world of the employee in the workplace. And so I'm going to look at online kinds of questions, and I'm going to look at psychological questions, but with that framework in mind. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some research that I've been doing over the past couple of years with a number of different co-authors and doctoral students. And it's really trying to ask the question of how are we managing the boundaries between our personal and our professional lives? And how is this online experience changing the nature of that management? I've been looking at this question of boundary management for many years now, actually, and as have others, from the question of, you know, how do people manage their work and family roles? How do they you know, navigate those boundaries between them? And you know, there's been a lot of work in this area suggesting that people have different preferences. Some people prefer to integrate their multiple roles, to kind of have their pictures of their kids in their workplace, right? To bring their work home with them. That's more of an integration strategy, and blurring the boundary between these roles. Whereas other people really like a bright line between their various life roles, trying to keep them separate. Even to the extent that there's actually been some research showing that some people keep separate keychains for work and home, right? So some very concrete and tangible examples of that separation. And so, you know, there's really a continuum that people exist on in terms of their preferences for segmentation versus integration. There are also various ways that this is enacted in the workplace. So policies that companies have, norms, expectations around how you interact with others and behave. Those also will play into these kinds of dimensions of integration versus segmentation. And that's always been the case. But what's new with the advent of online social media in particular, that blurs the boundary between the personal and the professional, is that all of a sudden we have a lot of different ways that our lives are being blurred, right? So prior to this, there was actually a physical separation, and you actually had to actively integrate. Whereas at this point, the default setting for many types of online social media types of platforms is integration, and you have to work really hard to keep these worlds separate. So, you know, prior to online social media, you know, I'd have work colleagues, I'd have high school friends, I'd have, you know, colleagues from various parts of my life. I have family, I have, you know, neighbors, et cetera, and they're all in their own place, right? And I kind of dyadically would interact with them, except for at a wedding or a funeral, right? But what happens with online social media, much of online social media, is that all of a sudden these audiences are overlapping, at least in my news feed, right? So I am seeing, you know, a post from my classmate who, from high school, and then the next post I'm seeing is a post from my work colleague, right? Or, you know, some other combination that you might imagine, right? And so there are these overlapping audiences, and as a result, what happens is it really is changing the way that we interact online versus offline. And so some of those differences are that this open disclosure to broad audiences is the default, and we actually have to work with the privacy settings and various kinds of things to kind of lock it down and keep things separate. The other difference is the information is persistent in time. So if I post something on Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram, you know, that's kind of out there. And even on Snapchat, which is supposed to be more ephemeral, if I post it and somebody takes a screenshot of it, it's out there, right? Whether I wanted it to be out there or not. And so that information is persistent in time. And then the last piece that I think is really important is that we lose some control. So we have we post things, or we might like things, or we might comment on things, we might interact with other people, and we're doing this for a lot of positive reasons of social connection and social engagement with other people. But we don't necessarily have control over what they're doing. So I post a picture of myself on vacation, and my crazy uncle makes some inappropriate comment that all of my work colleagues can see. You know, if I'm not immediately taking that down, everybody's seen it, right? So, you know, I can't control all of that information. And so, you know, I've ceded that control to the other people that are in my social network. And so what, you know, this is actually a good example of this lack of boundary control. So this is actually a post that is, you know, you can find, if you Google this, you can find it, you know, but it's a great example. This person posted, OMG, I hate my job. My boss is a total pervy wanker, always making me do, and by the way, the little redactions, I redacted them for professionalism, make me do blank stuff just to piss me off. And then her boss, Brian, says, hi, I guess you forgot about adding me on here. And then goes on to say other things, which you can read, and ends up saying, you know, you can pick up your last paycheck, you're fired. So, you know, so again, you know, first of all, we have this problem that, you know, if you post it, anybody can see it. The other piece of the persistence in time, there's this sort of virtual paper trail. This is actually a post from a GOP staffer a couple of years ago when Obama was in the White House, and it was a comment about Sasha and Malia, his daughters, and their clothing choices. And she was sort of, you know, kind of attacking these teenagers, and, you know, people were up in arms about this. She took it down immediately, but she was also fired for this, right? And so again, sometimes these things, there's no takebacks to some of these things, and they do go viral. And there's many, many examples of this. The other piece to this, which is also embedded in some of the challenges and the dilemmas that these types of interactions pose, is that there's something that the communication scholars have identified as invisible audiences, right? So when you post something, you're thinking about the people who are liking it or who are commenting on it, or maybe you've got somebody in mind as you're posting something or writing something or what have you, and that is who you're aiming this communication towards. But those are not the only people who are seeing it, right? And so, you know, this is a classic, you know, you post a party picture, these people are liking it and commenting, they're all happy, you think everything's good, but these are not the only people that have seen this post, right? And there are all the, you know, what do we call them, the stalkers, or the, you know, the people who are like, the what? The lurkers, yes, thank you, the lurkers. The lurkers are lurking, and they're judging some of them, right? Some of them are just lurking, and others are judging, right? And so, you know, you have this challenge as well. And so, and I want to point out, though, that this is not just a problem for things like those party pictures where it might be obvious to us that maybe we shouldn't have posted that, right? One of the interviews I did early on when I started this research stream was with a woman who worked for her synagogue. And it was a Reform synagogue, so not, you know, super observant, but it was, she worked for the synagogue, and she had posted a picture of her child playing soccer. This is not her child, but it was a similar type of picture, and on a Saturday. Okay, so problem with this, if you're not familiar, is that for synagogues and for Jews, the Saturday is Shabbat. So you're not supposed to be, first of all, playing soccer, and you're not supposed to be taking pictures of your kid playing soccer, right? Especially if you work for the synagogue. And so she posted this and forgot that she had accepted the friend request from her boss, the rabbi. And so on Sunday morning, he sort of took her aside and said, hey, you know, thanks so much for, you know, you're so wonderful, all the things you do here, but by the way, as an employee of the synagogue, you really shouldn't be posting these kinds of things on a Saturday, right? And she was pretty upset by this. You know, this is a wholesome activity that she was sharing with people, and she was a little upset, and she defriended him, which, led to other things, and later she left that position. But anyway, so there were complications that arose, not just from this, but from other things. And so when we think about managing our online social networks, there are dilemmas and challenges that we face, in terms of who we connect with and what content we disclose, right? We have choices to make about this. And the really interesting thing that started to come up for me as I thought about this in the workplace, and as I talk to people about this in the workplace, is that there's a very powerful role of hierarchy and differences in power that also play into this dilemma and this choice that people have. And one of the interesting things is that when I talk to people about this question, they started to talk about how they were equating their bosses with their mothers. And they wanted nothing to do with either of them on online social media. Okay, so it was very clear in terms of what people were thinking here. But the other question is, what are the consequences of either connecting with people on online social media or making the decision not to, right? Having a policy that you don't connect with people, or at work, or maybe connecting with some people and not others, right? And so what are the consequences of this for professional relationships in the workplace? And so that's the focus of the research stream that I've been engaging in. And so I'm going to share with you some data from one of the studies that I've done, which is titled OMG, My Boss Just Friended Me. And how many of you are friends with your boss on Facebook or other things? So we have so they're like, you're even three, exactly, right, that's the problem, right. So that's the problem. So, but we have some reluctant hands here, even if you are connected with people who are hierarchically superior to you in the chain. So this is work I've done with my colleague Ariane Ollier-Malater and Lakshmi Ramarajan. And so what we did was we asked this question about, first of all, are you willing to accept somebody's request, right, to connect with you on online social media, in particular kind of a Facebook type of a context, one that blends the personal and the professional. And later we then ask, what are the consequences of either accepting or rejecting that request? But in terms of your willingness to accept this request, we ask a couple questions. First of all, people are going to ask themselves, because there is this dilemma in the workplace, you're going to say, is it worth it? Am I getting something out of it from a socio-emotional perspective? Am I getting some benefit by learning something about this person? Are they somebody I want to be connected with because I like them, or that they seem warm? And so what we look at is whether the person self-discloses or not, right? There's a lot of literature on self-disclosure in psychology and how that is, really increases liking and connection with people. And so we're going to look at, do they self-disclose more or less? The other question, of course, that I already previewed is it safe to connect with this person? Is there a power dynamic? Is this person my boss, my peer, or my subordinate? And how does that play into the psychology that I have around whether this is a safe relationship? Because I'm potentially exposing lots of information about myself to this person. And then last, we ask about how the gender role expectations interact with these two factors. Because there's a lot of literature on especially leader gender role expectations and expectations of warmth from women leaders as well as competence. And so how does gender play a role is the other factor that we look at. And so we also then ask the question of, what are the consequences? So if I don't accept you, I essentially reject you, how do people react? Are they happy? I mean, there's a lot of psychological research showing that rejection is akin to pain, physical pain. We don't like being rejected. And so how does that play out in this online space? Can people say, you know what, I get it, it's kind of weird that we're connected this way, or do they feel like, yeah, you don't like me very much, right? And so these are the questions that we're asking. I did a couple of studies. First, we did an exploratory study that where we used qualitative data to kind of understand what people's psychology was about this, and then we did a series of experiments, which I'll describe in a moment. But the qualitative data really suggested that hierarchy was a big deal here in terms of people, the psychology people brought to this question. Receiving a request from a boss was seen as deeply uncomfortable. People used words like, it would make me feel insanely nervous, feeling of dread, trepidation, I'm trapped, I would feel uncomfortable, I want to stay safe, not get on the bad side. These are all the kinds of things that people are thinking of. Sending a request to a boss also was seen as quite awkward. I'd probably get called in to explain why I did such a weird thing. I think she would feel like I was trying to be her friend, also think I was trying to kiss up, things like that. People were very, very uncomfortable with this. Disclosure also mattered quite a bit. So disclosure would help to humanize people. People would say that they think of them as a person, more as an authority figure. People versus resources, have more compassion and understanding, similar interests can improve this. But evaluation happened too. We saw that people were judging. It does influence how I view them. It makes me think less of them, potentially. One of my subordinates posted something once that made me think he was stupider than humanly possible, right? So, there is some risk here, right? Gender also mattered. More men versus women had relationships with their work colleagues on social media. They received more Facebook requests from their bosses and subordinates and were more likely to accept the request. And they were more likely to initiate a request. So one person said, I sent a friend request from one of my former bosses. This is a guy who said this. She didn't accept because she didn't realize that it was platonic. She was uncomfortable around me after that. And I tried to explain that it would be convenient to communicate about work, and she didn't believe me. Right? So, this is, by the way, prior to the Harvey Weinstein scandal, okay? So we are even seeing some of these effects, just in these very basic kinds of things. And so the sting of rejection was also a very powerful theme. When a boss didn't accept my request, I felt rejected and not much respected. It made me feel lost and hurt, made me lose respect for that individual. But it was particularly consequential among rejected bosses. So I felt rejected. I was no longer willing to stand up for that person or help them climb up the ladder. And then another said, I have only had a previous subordinate reject one of my requests, and it made me feel stupid because I felt like I liked them more than they liked me. We're back in high school here, right? So, this is a very kind of powerful phenomenon that people are experiencing. So what we then tried to do was look at this experimentally, and we looked at it in a couple of different ways. So the first experiment that I'm going to describe asked about your willingness to accept a friend request as the dependent variable. And so as I described earlier, we have these various conditions: hierarchical rank, self-disclosure, and whether the person is a man or a woman. So a 3 by 2 by 2, always fun. And so we did an experiment where we varied the profile pictures that we showed to them. So this was more disclosure versus less. We varied the pictures. We actually rated those pictures on how attractive they were, and we actually asked people how attractive they were and controlled for that. There was no difference with controlling or not. We also then told them this is either your boss, your peer, or your subordinate. So this is how we did these manipulations. And then what we found was that more disclosure led to a higher likelihood of accepting the request. Hierarchy, peer, you're more likely to accept a peer than either a boss or a subordinate, and there was no difference between the boss or a subordinate. And there was also a three-way interaction. And this three-way interaction was driven by actually the boss condition. So women bosses who disclosed more were more likely to be accepted. Women bosses who disclosed less were shunned. And the opposite pattern was apparent for the men, and it was marginally significant at the 0.10 level. Okay, so that's that we call this the creep factor, right? So men who are bosses who are disclosing more, again, people felt a little creeped out by that. So we then did a second experiment where, and I'm going to go through this at lightning speed because I don't have a lot of time, but where we added a mediator of relational warmth to see if that was explaining these relationships. We changed up the photos just to make sure it wasn't anything about the photos. And so we also did this on a different population with more working adults. And again, we replicated all the main effect findings. We replicated the three-way interaction finding. The mediator of perceived warmth was significant and explained the relationship for the female bosses. And so then what we did was a third experiment where we flipped the frame. And here what we're doing is trying to understand what happens if you are rejected versus accepted. And so for our participants, what we said to them is, you've sent out now a request, and this person has either accepted or rejected you. And that person, by the way, is either your boss or your subordinate, and they're disclosing more or less, and your gender is also going to affect how you're going to react to this, okay? So we didn't manipulate that, but we used the participant gender. And so here the DV was your willingness to engage in an ongoing relationship with this person. And so we did this on MTurk, where we said this person has somebody who's either sending you an MTurk hit or you receive an MTurk hit from. That was the boss versus subordinate way of explaining this. And so your willingness to work with them again in the future was the DV. And so, and these were the conditions that we looked at. Again, acceptance or rejection, but also looking at the other factors that I have already talked about. So what we found is acceptance versus rejection is huge. That was a very powerful predictor of how willing you were to continue to work together, not surprisingly. The disclosure also predicted your willingness to work with somebody again in the future, so more disclosure versus less was positively associated with this. Your hierarchical rank also. So again, here it was that if you were a boss, regardless of what you did, people were more willing to work with you again. And so that was what we found there. And there were a couple of three-way interactions that we found. Rank, disclosure, and rejection did influence this relationship. So people who were rejected by subordinates are less willing to work with somebody again, right? There's something that it's violating kind of our expectation. And in particular, if you didn't disclose, if you don't want to work with that person again. They're cold and they're a subordinate who's rejected you. You want nothing to do with them, right? Similarly, with gender, there was a three-way interaction where basically male subordinates, or men who were rejected by their subordinates, so male bosses rejected by their subordinates, very unhappy. They don't want to work with you again. Women were more accepting, okay? And so here's sort of just that condition of rejection. And you can see that the only difference here is really the men who were rejected by their subordinates. They are the ones who are very unhappy. And so a couple implications. What we think from this research is that accepting or rejecting an online friend request is actually consequential for your feelings about how you work with others and for ongoing relationships. There are important gender differences to consider, and what we need to think about is what strategies are going to enable us to be more effective in the future. And I've got a couple of ongoing projects that look at that I'd be happy to talk with you on offline, but I want to open it up to questions. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so generally acceptance and rejection in daily life is super painful.
Yeah.
For people, when you get rejected, and it feels
Absolutely.
good when you get accepted. So another way to interpret your research is that the effects are actually surprisingly small in some ways. That is, you do get some effects on acceptance and rejection, but in most of the conditions and most of the graphs you showed, you don't.
Right.
And I'm wondering if
people are more willing to be forgiving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, the other way to interpret that maybe is that our social relationships online just aren't that powerful. So there's a lot of data that suggests that connecting with people online doesn't give people the same kind of benefits that connecting with somebody in person does. And I'm wondering if that's not another way to read your results?
I think it's possible, although I think that what we have here is we're not looking at the real relationships that we have, right? We're doing a fake profile, and so these aren't people that you've actually engaged with. If you were to actually reject me and we work together, I might feel more powerfully, right? Because it's not. I think that what's interesting about it is the layering of the online versus and the face-to-face. And I think what you're right is with people you don't know as well, we can shrug it off a little bit better, right? And perhaps in virtual interactions where we're in maybe global organizations and we don't really know the people too well, that may be the same. That may be the equivalent of what you're saying here. But I think that what we see, and again, what we see when we get from the qualitative data is when people are talking about the real experiences they've had with this, it's pretty painful, right? And so again, I'm trying to go back and forth between these different methodologies to try to get the power of the different methodologies to show the effect. But I think that that's really interesting for relationships that are not as reinforced in terms of real life and work connections. So thanks. Yeah.
Very nice work, thanks. To what extent did the people who you studied create customized spaces to manage this context collapse? Because you could accept your friend request, but you're just very savvy about creating these customized spaces for who sees what posts.
Yes.
So were they just not savvy
So
in doing
here,
this?
we kind of controlled all of that, but I have other work where we've looked at the different strategies that people use, and so some people, there are actually 4 strategies. I don't know, maybe I think they're hidden, so I think it'll be too hard to show you here. But there are 4 strategies that we've identified. One is called an audience strategy, where people kind of very carefully curate their audience, who they let in. They're very limited in terms of who they let in and connect with. There is a strategy we call the content strategy, where people are very careful from an impression management standpoint about what they post. Then there are people who are what we call open. They let it all hang out, good, bad, the ugly. I'm sure you know people like this, right? Okay, you've got somebody like this in your life, right? And then the last is this custom strategy that people use where they use the privacy settings really carefully. They put people on different lists. They parse things really carefully. But what we have found with that is, first of all, that takes a lot of skill. It also takes a lot of time, and people mess up even with that. And so when you mess up, then all of a sudden it's exposed to people that they were on this list and not that list, and then they get even more upset, right? And so again, I think if you're really good about it and you can take the time to do it and you're really skilled, that is going to be a very effective strategy, but it's not a strategy that I would say is going to be accessible to the vast majority of people. So, but it's a fantastic question and one I've been thinking a lot about. And what we also find, by the way, is that the people who use this open strategy of the letting it all hang out, they actually do worse on a group task. So there's something about that strategy that when you have a lot of that going on in people, even though it has nothing to do with the work, right? And that's controlling for conscientiousness, controlling for extroversion, we control for the big 5, and that effect still exists. So it's something about that open strategy that is causing a deterioration in terms of the quality of the work. Perhaps not the quality of the relationships, but the quality of the work. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
About a dozen years ago, we did a study on online dating and looking at impression management. And I'd encourage you to look at 3 different levels of self-disclosure, because we found a curvilinear relationship that people didn't like people who disclosed very little or people who disclosed a lot. And it was the moderate disclosers that seemed to have a better impression. And you can certainly manipulate that pretty easily.
Absolutely.
Just blows up your design into a 2x2 by 3x2.
Right, exactly. Right. Thank you for recognizing the complexity of that. No, absolutely. And I think that what's so interesting about this is what we did was we tried to even make this disclosure also very appropriate, right? So this is not even getting into inappropriate disclosures or things that are negative even. So I mean, there's so much to kind of explore here in terms of the content piece of it, and as well as I think your point is very well taken about the kind of 3 levels of TMI, or almost the Goldilocks, too much, just right, and too little, and I think that there's definitely that factor as well. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know where, I'm going with where the microphones are for people. Yeah.
And we'll take one more question.
I just have a question about the nature of your data, and this applies to Kate also. So in the circles I run in, mostly the publications of this sort are published at conferences like Chi, and there's a lot of work on Facebook behavior. And many of the scholars in that area are asking very similar questions, but they're using data by collaborating with people within Facebook,
Right.
and within Amazon in the case of Kate, and so that you can look at people's actual behavior.
Right.
For example, how much they edit their posts. Do they retract their posts? Do they what's their estimate of the invisible audience, which is something like people only think about 27% of their actual audience. I'm just wondering about your choice of and your access to data, which could really help.
Absolutely. I would love more access to that data. I haven't had that, and so I would love access to that data. So I think that would be really great to be able to look at that. One of the things, though, that I was also trying to do with this approach is experimentally manipulate some of this stuff to see, which I'm not sure would be as acceptable, right, with real data. So that's the balancing, right, between these different methods and these different sources of data, and I think that I agree it would be wonderful to enhance the research with that.